We have a very special podcast for you today. Today, we want to talk about the pursuit of happiness and specifically looking at conventional choices and determining whether or not those choices make sense for your life or whether or not those conventions are actually chains that are trapping you on the hamster wheel. If they are, you could make the choice to live an unconventional lifestyle and design the future that you want to live into. And to have this conversation, there is no one better than Dominick Quartuccio, who actually has written the book, Design Your Future. Dominick once had it all, a so-called successful life and lucrative 15-year career in the financial services. He led a good life. The result, he was bored, restless, and uninspired. So he left the corporate world and focused on experiences that challenged him to assess his long-held beliefs and stories. And today, he wants to share this journey with our community. And this is a very personal story, especially for my co-host Brad, because he has relied on Dominick's coaching and leaned heavily on that coaching for the last several years. Brad, do you want to just take a second to talk about your own experiences with Dom?
Yeah, Dominick has been a friend of mine for almost 20 years now, going back to our undergrad days at the University of Richmond. And as I've gone through my professional life and now have attained some level of, quote, success with my online businesses, I've realized how much of life is psychological. And you out there in the audience, you hear me talking about this all the time. And honestly, I get much of my information from Dominick. He is the guy that I rely on. So that's why this is truly a special podcast for me. And I could not be more excited to have him here and to have him share not only his story with you, but his teachings as well, because I think he can help our community significantly. And it's a slight departure from our normal guests. He's not embedded in the FI community, but as he's listened to our podcast, he's realized just how many similarities there are with focusing on happiness, with focusing on freedom, and these bedrock principles that we talk about over and over here at Choose FI. So yes, we could not be more excited to have him here. And with that, welcome to the Choose FI Radio Podcast.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
So we are back, and Dom, thank you for joining us here on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brad.
Yeah, this is awesome. And it's intensely personal for me because you really have become such a big part of my life in the last couple of years. And it's an interesting journey, right? We knew each other, I guess, 20 years ago at the University of Richmond when we were both on the student government. And yeah, right? I mean, we lost touch for many years and then just reconnected, I guess, about 3 years ago, you'd say?
Yeah, that's right. And reconnected stronger than ever.
Yeah, stronger than ever. We got together for lunch and it was just like this instant connection. And it's because a lot of what we've each been discovering on parallel paths has tied in so directly. And it's fascinating to me, actually, how we kind of approach it from minor different perspectives. But we've been pursuing the same path, and that is happiness and freedom and taking control of your life. And as you say in your book, designing your future, designing your life. So it really was like one of those magical connections. And as I've mentioned on the podcast here a couple of times, I went on a men's retreat back in March. And actually that was Dominick's retreat. He was the guy who put this together, designed the entire weekend. And it was one of those transformative weekends for me that really opened my eyes to what community is like and having this group of men around you who are all looking to make themselves better, to have this future that they want and that they're yearning for. And Dom, I just wanted to pass along a huge thank you personally here on the podcast. I know, I've alluded to it many times, but that was a wonderful weekend.
Brad, thank you for that too. And not to leave the ladies out, because I got quite a bit of an outcry saying, hey, what about us? And currently in the process of doing something similar for a women's retreat like that. But yeah, Brad, I think the real impetus of designing something like that was I saw so many talented men in my life, men like you who, had reached a certain financial place in life, who started asking different questions about their life. Like, is there more? Did I dream big enough? Why do I feel this sense of restlessness in life that I've created for myself, even though on paper, I should be grateful for everything I have. And I'm having these feelings of guilt for not feeling so grateful and wanting more. And what's that about? And not knowing exactly where to turn. And when I realized, that was my journey, I hit that 7 or 8 years ago, and I was directionless at that point, didn't know where to go. So I went on a path of self-discovery and bounced around a lot, made a lot of mistakes, made a lot of amazing discoveries. I said, I want to be able to provide this for a community of men. And I know that you've talked about this in previous podcasts, like community is one of the most important things, especially as we are accelerating into the future where there's just so much uncertainty around the way that the labor market's going to look. The connections and the deep, meaningful relationships that you have are going to be something that will endure. So that has been one of the most rewarding things from that men's retreat, just to see the way that you guys have kept in touch and the successes you've all had as a result of it. There's no bigger reward.
Yeah, the community that you built has been amazing. And I've kept in touch with many of those people, had somebody fly in here to Richmond and we sat down for brunch. And, just those human connections that I'm constantly talking about on the podcast, they are just crucial in life. And, to touch on a couple things you mentioned there, that feeling of restlessness, I think a lot of us experience it. And as you mentioned, it almost feels like you're an ingrate or something. How can I have these issues in my life when everything is perfect? I personally live this, what I believe to be this wonderful, perfect life. But yet there are still those moments when you say, all right, well, what next? Or as our friend Keith at the retreat said, I never dreamed past here.
Yeah.
And that is just such an impactful quote. And I think a lot of us feel that and we don't really talk about it. Right. And that's why having you on here is so important for the FI community and the community at large, because we do need to talk about this stuff. We need to talk about designing our futures and being excited about the future. Right. I think that's something that you talk about a lot, is really not just drifting through life, but being intentional and excited about things to come.
Brad, one of the things that you just said that I absolutely love is this feeling of guilt around not being as grateful as you feel you should be for what you have. And in the work that I've been doing, especially over the last 18 months, one of the biggest barriers that I see for people having everything that they want in their life is feeling guilty for wanting more. And the fact that they say that because I have such a great life, I have a family, I have children, or I have a great job, I have this great house, and there are other people who have so much less than I do, I should feel satisfied with what I have, that actually becomes a self-imposed ceiling. And I see it time and time again, so that people stay stuck in that place of complacency. And drift is the word that you use, Brad. And I have to give a little bit of context to where I discovered that word for the first time, because when I explain it to people, they go, oh my God, that's me. So if you allow me a little bit of an aside, drift is a word that I discovered from Napoleon Hill. And if you guys are Think and Grow Rich fans, like I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, Think and Grow Rich is one of the best-selling business book and personal development book of all time. Only 15 books have ever sold over 50 million copies, and they're all pretty much like Harry Potter and those kinds of books. And Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich is the only one that made it into that echelon. But I like a book that he'd written even better that was buried for 70 or 80 years because his family deemed it too controversial for the times. And it was called Outwitting the Devil. Now, this book, if you don't know, Napoleon Hill was basically big during the Depression era. That's like when he did most of his work. And one of the things that changed his course of his life was he had a conversation with Andrew Carnegie that said, hey, if you want to know the secrets of the most successful people in the world, go interview hundreds of the most successful people in the world, but then go interview like 5 or 10 times as many people who felt like they didn't live the lives that they wanted to. So he ended up interviewing 500 of the world's greatest, right? So like the Henry Fords, the Rockefellers, Thomas Edison, and then when he he ended up interviewing about 25,000 people who near the end of their lives felt like they had not accomplished what they wanted to. So he interviewed way more people who didn't succeed than did. Now, if Think and Grow Rich was the Bible for how to attract riches into your life, Outwitting the Devil became this book for, it was kind of like a bookend to that story. And it was a cautionary tale for what happens if you live an unintentional life. And the term that's used in there over and over again is this concept of drifting. And drifting is this state of existence where you think you're consciously making decisions, but you're actually just kind of meandering through life in this hypnotic rhythm. And it's only when the power of an outside force thrusts itself upon you, like losing a job, like getting an illness, like being jilted or dumped, like it's usually something pretty crappy. Then and only then do most people actually sit up and take control of their lives for the first time, because their foundational belief systems have been shaken to the very core. And what goes on to be described in that book is, why do we have to be beholden to an outside force thrusting itself upon us to be the only catalyst for us to change? And when I read that, it was like my mind exploded. And that was back in 2011. It was during Hurricane Sandy. I was here in New York City with all of like the lights and the power out. So there's like no distraction. It just went in all the way, and it shifted everything about me. And then I had a chance to see so many great and talented people living their lives in a state of drift, and they were becoming increasingly unhappy, even though they had everything on paper that they were supposed to. So yeah, Brad, that became my mission, was to help break people free from drift.
It's shocking to me that this is a word that was in a book from the 50s. Is that what we're talking about?
Earlier, I think 20s and 30s.
That's amazing. But yeah, it's a powerful, powerful visual image.
It is. Yeah. And so there's a number of questions actually that you can start to ask yourself, if you're like, well, am I a drifter or not? And there's 7 questions I typically ask people, but I'll hit like a couple of them because I think they'll be relevant for your listeners. Is number 1, your primary decision making, what causes you to get into action, is based on fear. And I work with a lot of top performers, right? So these are people who are pretty successful. And when I ask them this question, the first reaction is like, no, I'm not a fearful person. But then I peel back the layer of the onion. And one of the common themes I find for top performers is they are top performers because they're undyingly fearful of not being good enough, of failing, of looking bad. And it was either maybe an expectation that was set up at a very young age or whatnot. It was a belief system that was adopted early. And one of the ways that I tell people that you can start to understand if you've built a life around fear, it's when your wins don't feel all that great anymore. And when your losses start to feel like increasingly worse, or the worst part of all is if you don't really feel anything, whether you win or lose, or you start to get numb to kind of any high or low, that's when you've built an entire life around fear. And that's why I ended up writing the book about Design Your Future, which is an intentionality. It's a towards something, like living into a future that you're excited to live into versus constantly running away from the things that you fear.
Yeah, and we constantly talk about the hamster wheel here. And I think there's a lot of that in what you're talking about, which is just going through the motions. And you talk about being numb. Many people go through their lives without any sense of progress or excitement. We're talking about excitement, but progress to me is another crucial aspect of being a satisfied human being, right? And like for me, it's incremental progress over many, many years. This is something that maybe I was drifting for years when I was in my typical tax manager job sitting at a desk, but something switched in me a couple years ago when I left my job. And now it's a lot of this information that I take in. And Dom, we listen to a lot of the same podcasts, Jocko Willink and Tim Ferriss, and all these things that I pick up from them. It's about finding things that excite you, finding things that are challenging. Like you sent an email to me and a couple other guys maybe 2 months ago about what are those things that make you wake up giddy as a kid on Christmas morning? Yeah. Or what makes you, as you said, I think, throw up a little bit in your mouth when you're scared or frightened of doing something different. It's those emotions that make us human. And I think so many people maybe numb themselves or purposely avoid them. And that's just the wrong way to go about it. And I know I've made changes just because of that email. And I didn't even tell you this, but I joined CrossFit recently. And I was scared of that for years. And it's something that I'd contemplated, but I always thought, oh, am I in good enough shape? Am I going to show up and be embarrassed? And it was all these negative thoughts that I was just limiting myself for no reason whatsoever. And I just said, you know what? Screw that. Dom said, do something that's going to make you a little bit frightened, or, throw up in your mouth a little bit. And hell, I'm going to do this. And it's been great. I've been going for about 2 months now, and it's fantastic. So that's just one tiny little way that one email you sent impacted my life.
Well, I did know that you joined CrossFit because I listened to your podcast, and I remember you were mentioning that. So great for you. And yeah, think about that. If you were to ask yourself the question, when you look out over your horizon towards your future, is there something that lights you up, like if you were a kid who celebrated Christmas, being a kid at Christmas? Or maybe when you were a kid, like you loved your birthday. Like, is there anything on your horizon that gets you that excited? And the closest thing that 90% of people have to that is a vacation. And even that's less of a really exciting thing for people. It's more like I'm looking forward to it. There's an escape, but there's missing that emotional element that along with it comes a sense of growth. Right? For most people, they go on vacation, they don't grow during that. It's usually like an escape just to get away from the grind. But if you plan something that's like an adventure, or you join CrossFit, or is that thing you thought you wanted to do for quite a long time, like leaving your corporate job or writing a book or starting a blog, like those things are all scary because it involves risk and failure, et cetera. Those are the very things that actually create the tension that allows for you to grow. And if there's an absence of that in your life, then you probably know that you are drifting because there's an element of fear that's keeping you stuck. And Brad, the last thing that you mentioned about progress is huge. And I'm finding that increasingly people have a harder time feeling that sense of progress because people are so busy. You finish one thing, there's 20 more things always waiting for you. You never feel like you're getting ahead of the ball game. And therefore, it's just like this rat race, this hamster wheel, like you mentioned. What I love about FI is there's a very tangible sense of progress. Like when you start to put money away and it grows over a course of time. I spent 15 years in corporate financial services in the 401k arena. So like this is what I know. I remember putting in my first pennies into my 401k account. I know what I had when I left 15 years later. It almost felt like a miracle. So if you're not doing things that allow you to get that sense of progress, that is where the restlessness starts to kick in.
And there's so many similar, parallel, powerful concepts that you explore in your book that when I was reading through it, I was just astounded by. And one of those that really struck me was this idea of the power of beliefs and maybe the power of false beliefs. And I'd love to hear you explore how beliefs impact the choices that you make. And sometimes they can impact it in a very negative way.
Yeah. Wow. I love this question about belief systems and how they can be so limiting. And I think that most people don't even realize how pervasive their belief systems are in terms of how that could help accelerate their future, but how it can also put this ceiling over your head. So one of the stories that I love telling about one of my prevailing limiting beliefs was I left the corporate space 18 months ago, but about 2.5 years before that. So it took me 2.5 years to decide that I was going to make my exit. 2.5 years before that, I was meditating and I got this epiphany that said, I want to build my future around coaching and speaking and writing and inspiring people, helping them remove obstacles. And wouldn't that be amazing? And then the very next voice that entered my mind right after that epiphany, like my whole body was vibrating, the very next voice that entered my mind was, but you could never make as much money doing that as what you're doing right now. And what I was doing right then was I was the sales manager for the eastern half of the country for a Fortune 100 firm. So the pay was lucrative. And in that moment, I didn't even inspect that story, that belief. It just rang true to me. I accepted it as truth. So for 6 months, I did nothing about that epiphany I had. I allowed that story to basically douse out the flames of my creativity. Until fortunately, again, 6 months later, when I was doing another meditation, I felt that same vibration come back up that I meant to do something bigger than what I'm doing right now, something that's more in line with my passion. And then again, that voice came in my head and said, you could never make as much money doing that as what you're doing right now. Except this time, I actually challenged the question. I challenged the belief. And I said, well, wait a minute, who says? What if I could make 10 times as much money doing what I believe in and what I'm passionate about as what I'm doing right now? What would stop me? And the important thing here is that I didn't necessarily believe that I could make 10 times as much. I just went through the intellectual exercise. And then I said, well, actually, nothing would be stopping me. So I said, okay, cool. Well, I'm not ready to make the leap on just that alone, but I let that marinate. And I kept asking that question in my mind, for the next couple of days. I said, what if I can make 10 times as much? And what ended up happening, this power of suggestion to my unconscious mind and my conscious mind, allowed me to start finding these examples of people who had done exactly that. People who had built entire lives around what they're passionate about. So guys like Tim Ferriss, I know his name's thrown around on your podcast all the time, but like he changed my life with his books and his writing. You have Gary Vee, you have Marianne Williamson. People just have done this with their lives. And eventually it started to pull in all these different pieces of evidence that it could be done. I could write a book, I could write a blog, I could go coaching, I could do public speaking. And then all of a sudden, once that nebulous fear of not making enough and that faulty belief of never being able to make enough was decimated, then I said in February of 2016, I'm going to leave Prudential. That was the company I worked for. And so for 2 years, I had the time of my life, and I was actually the most productive and most vibrant employee that they ever had because I had this sense of purpose. So for the last 2 years that I was working there, I brought the most of myself to work, and it was the best 2 years that I had there. And when I left, man, it was just like I felt like I was flying.
And there's a very striking concept right there buried in that you pivoted from the pursuit of money to the pursuit of happiness and identity with this transition.
Absolutely. And I love talking about happiness because, I'd say 95% of my clients had a belief at some point in time that like money was going to buy them happiness. And most of my clients do have a lot of money. And what's funny is there's very little happiness that exists in that space. And, one of the books that I'm a huge fan of, and you guys could probably do an entire conversation on this, and Brad, I sent this to you last week, is called The Last Safe Investment. Jonathan, have you heard of this?
I have not, but I hope to hear about it right now.
Yeah. Well, The Last Safe Investment, it's a phenomenal book by a guy named Brian Franklin, and I think it was co-written by Michael Ellsberg. The Last Safe Investment they talk about is you. And there's a conversation in here around your happiness index. And they talk about, hey, let's just use you two guys' example. So Brad, let's say you make $100,000 a year. Jonathan, you make $100,000 a year. But if Brad is twice as happy as you are, Jonathan, then your happiness index is lower, right? Your happiness index, it's more expensive for you to be happy. So Brad could be, he could have $50,000 and be just as happy as you at 100. So like, what are the things that you spend and invest your money on that actually magnify the happiness in your life? And another one of the concepts in this book talks about systemic spending. And they say that if you think about what you spend your money on, don't just look at it for the category that you spend in, look how it affects the entire system that you operate in. So let me use an example specifically. I go to the Equinox gym, which is a big gym in New York City and there's other different parts of the country. They have like 30 locations here. Equinox is super expensive. It's like a high end. I pay $200 a month to be a part of that. And that probably like drives people crazy when they hear that. If I were looking at that expense just purely in terms of like working out, that would be ludicrous. Because I could get workouts for free at home, or I could go, somewhere work out in the park and get the same similar workouts for free or for a few bucks. But I look at the Equinox, how it affects the rest of my system. It is a social place for me. I've met a lot of my good friends over the last 10 years in living in New York City from Equinox. When I travel, they're in a lot of the cities that I travel to, and then I can go to a place that feels like home and actually end up bumping into newer people and establishing relationships. It's a home base for me if I ever need to work because it's got free Wi-Fi. So you see how like one investment can increase my happiness in all these other arenas that affects my system and systemic spending. So I do a lot of work around like, what is it that makes you happy? Because it doesn't require a lot of money. In many cases, it requires less. You just need to be intentional and not be drifting around where it is you're spending your money because you think or someone told you or society tells you that that's what's supposed to bring happiness.
And Dom, when you were talking about that, I'm thinking in my head the word intentionality. And then for you to bookend it with that is perfect because that really is what we talk about here at Choose FI. Because I don't have an issue with people spending money in general if they deem there's value there. My concern is when people are just spending money without any thought and it's just going away. Like we had Joel and Alexis from Phi 180 here a couple of weeks ago, and that was just a wonderful episode where they talked about how they changed their life. They had this 180 from spending over $100,000 a year just mindlessly with no intentionality at all. And they couldn't even answer where that money was going. So we met them at Camp Mustache a couple of months ago. And at that point, they could not tell us how they spent an extra somewhere in the vicinity of $70,000 a year. And that to me is crazy. There was no intentionality to that. And it was just on frivolous nonsense that they derived no happiness from and did nothing for their well-being. Whereas you have determined, okay, Equinox is expensive. Like you've admitted, some people might think that's preposterous, but you've thought about it and you get value out of it. And like I've mentioned on the podcast, my pool, we spend $500 a summer at our pool, but that is our happy place. I mean, and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, that's where we spend our entire summer, and our family and our kids are going to think about that for the rest of their lives. They're going to have memories of spending that wonderful time with their parents. And I'm fortunate to be there every single day because of this FI lifestyle that I've pursued. So it's every step of the way. You talk about intentionality, and I'm just very glad that you focused on that in particular.
Yeah, and it breaks my heart when you hear stories like people who have spent $70,000 have no idea where it went, or when people come to me. So when people come to me, there's usually a problem, right? Like when they want to coach, there's something in their life that they've been dealing with and they're not willing for it to continue any longer. But one of the things I constantly see, especially with married couples, and particularly with married couples with children, is that they've boxed themselves into a corner financially. They've overbought on their house. They've overbought on cars. One of the things that my financial advisor recently told me is that parents are spending way more on their children indiscriminately to box themselves into a corner where there's absolutely no flexibility left. And that's not a judgment on parents whatsoever. I think that what she's saying is one of the habits that's seen is I want to take care of my kids at all costs. And there's a little intentionality that's brought into those decisions that are made. It's just give them what they need. And what ends up happening is that there's no flexibility or bandwidth left in the system, so that when something is needed, like to invest in coaching, or like a job gets eliminated and they need to live off of savings, there are none, or like someone wants to pursue their passion, they're really talented but can't afford to leave because every last cent's accounted for and now you're stuck and trapped in your life. Like these are the unintentional decisions that lead to putting these invisible prison bars around you. And that breaks my heart. And I know that's exactly why the two of you are so motivated in doing what you're doing, is because you want other people to experience the kind of freedom and happiness that you're currently living.
And the construct that we find over and over again that's replicated is someone is using the term that you've mentioned here, drifting, passively going through life. Grazing is another way that we have said it on this show. And then at some point, I think Brad borrowed this term from you, they have this awakening. There's some sort of trigger. And a lot of times, like you said, it's an outside force that thrusts itself upon you.
Yeah, that's right. And just to give a little more context on awakening quickly. So there's two types of awakenings. There's the unintentional awakenings, Jonathan, like you just mentioned, the outside force thrusting itself upon you. And that's pretty much the catalyst for 99% of behavior change in people. It's like some negative event that happens, an outside force thrusting itself upon. And then where I'm a proponent is to create these intentional awakenings, right? Like we become the catalyst of our own awakenings by putting ourselves into these situations. And Brad, like you talked about signing up for CrossFit, like you created an awakening there for yourself because it was nervous for you. Like it was something that you felt like could stretch you and put you in a situation you didn't know if you were going to fail or not. And by the way, your podcast, like what you're talking about, when people tune in, they are accelerating their ability to have awakenings because you're giving them new information. The distinction I'd make between awareness and having an awakening is actually taking action. And I know you're big proponents of like making sure that people take at least one actionable thing out of every one of your conversations. You can be aware, like there are a lot of smokers who are aware that they will get themselves sick, they'll get cancer by smoking, but it doesn't change their behavior. It's not until like the diagnosis that happens that maybe that some of them decide, you know what, I'm going to take action, that awakening occurs. But again, it's usually this negative thing. So I'm a proponent of how do we catalyze our own awakenings? That's part one. And then part two, okay, now that you know that something has to change, it's like, okay, well, what's the action I take next? And I offer up the second step of how to bring yourself out of drift. So the first place is awakening. Next part is disrupting yourself. And disrupting could take a number of different forms. So disrupting could be stopping something. So for example, like temporary abstinence around people who like drink a lot, or they eat a lot of sugar, or they maybe overworkout. Some people are workout fanatics. To take a intentional temporary pause on something and to kind of kill the thing that you love temporarily, or that you do, a habit, so that you can start to get feedback on why it is you do what you do. So I'm constantly doing these things like 60 days off of TV and Netflix, 90 days off of alcohol, just to understand why I was doing that stuff to begin with. And it gives you such an illumination around all the societal behaviors and expectations that cause you to do things you do, even when you don't. You're like, man, I don't actually even like this. I'm just doing it because I thought I had to.
That's incredible. I love that. I think I've, in some degree, felt the pull to try something like that in my life over and over again, but I don't know if I did it in the context of an awakening. But just switching things up in your life, getting out of the monotony of the day-to-day and looking to see what's excessive, what's unnecessary, what is just, frankly, a chain trapping you to your current rut that you're in. In many cases, I think it's food. It's watching TV. It's maybe looking at your cell phone 45 times a day. It's hard to know what your addictions and your pain points are until you just try to remove everything or something one at a time, just to figure out what it is that you are subtly addicted to.
I love it. This would be really helpful in terms of something to take away. One of the greatest insights that I've ever come across was by a man named Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl is the author of Man's Search for Meaning, one of the best books you could ever read about finding your purpose and meaning in life. And Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. So talk about being able to find hope in the most hopeless of circumstances. That book is a must read if you ever want to get connected to purpose or meaning. But one of the things that actually wasn't even in that book that he said that was really profound, he talks about stimulus and response. And he says that in between stimulus and response, there's a space. And inside that space lies our ability to choose a new response. And that's basically our gateway to all sorts of freedoms that we want in our life. So Jonathan, like you were just talking about stimulus, come home from work, you're exhausted, you grab a tub of Ben & Jerry's, sit on the couch, Family Guy for 3 hours, right?
That sounds like a great night.
That actually does. I'm like talking myself into it right now. But that's the response, right? Okay, stimulus, work pisses you off. Response, like you go and bury yourself in social media for an hour. And over the course of a long period of time, these stimulus and responses can get so entangled that they're like clamping your fists together. They seem like you can't even, there's no space in between them. But what is offered up by Frankl, it says, no. If you can interrupt that stimulus response cycle, so the stimulus happens, and instead of responding the way you typically do, you step back. There's an infinite number of ways that you could respond. You just have to have the intentionality to choose that, and therefore you can create a new behavior and a new future as a result of that. So you guys are doing that all the time with your listeners and on offering new ways of investing money or stopping spending, and that's what I would categorize as an interruption inside of disrupting yourself.
And Dom, what's funny here is that I'm sitting with my thumb on the Viktor Frankl quote on page 63 of your book as I was getting ready to say that precisely before you read it. So,
stealing his thunder.
We're on the exact same page, literally on the exact same page here. I know that was one of my big takeaways, that space between the stimulus and the response from the retreat that we went on. So that truly was my big takeaway. And I've implemented that in my life. So I know, like you mentioned in the book, I think 95% of what we do, what we believe is all habitual. It's built in. And we don't even think about it because it truly is habitual and it's just going on in the background. And for me, now that I'm aware of that, that's just not good enough. So I actually think about that quote and it's an absolute game changer. So I know just in dealing with your family, I mean, I love my family, but you still respond negatively sometimes. And I found myself actually having conversations with my wife, Laura, where she'll say something and I will go to respond like I normally would and actually stop myself and say, why are you doing that? That's just built on some story that doesn't mean anything. And I know that very particular quote is something that I keep with me on a daily basis. And I would challenge the audience out there to think about that. Think about that space. Actually think about it as a space in your conversations, in your life, between whatever that stimulus is and whatever your response normally would be. And I challenge you to change it and just actually think about it. So I think that will be a big actionable takeaway from this episode. And I know, Dominick, was a big actionable takeaway from our retreat.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned there, I think it'd be helpful to just dive a little bit deeper on was this 95-5 principle. So 95% of your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors fall below your conscious detection. And neuroscience has shown that that's pretty much the case. And you may hear other numbers like it's 90% or 87%, whatever it is. It's the vast majority of your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors fall below your conscious detection. And that's where your habits, your patterns, your belief systems, your stories exist. That's where, let's say, the upbringing that you had exists. That's where the environment that you live in exists. That's the socioeconomic factors that you've been exposed to for most of your life exist. These are the things that are on autopilot. And though we think we're driving our own car and calling our own shots consciously all of the time, it's actually this 95%. Now, the 5% is where, that's our conscious thinking. This is where you can make the determination to put the space between stimulus and response. That 5% is the thing that allows you to consciously choose the new behavior going forward. The problem with this 5%, this is where your discipline and willpower exist. And your discipline and willpower, it's like a gas in a gas tank. It gets depleted, and it gets depleted fast. That's why by the end of the day, that's why you bring in the Ben and Jerry's to the couch with Family Guy for 3 or 4 hours. Like, you're just done. When you're exhausted, it's done.
And I guess part of that is once you realize that construct, you can hack it, right? To a degree.
Absolutely. Yeah, without question. So once you understand that construct, which is what I'm constantly saying to myself, is 95.5, 95.5. It's like, okay, what behavior is no longer serving me? What mindset is no longer serving me? It could be like a fear around money, right? So for example, moving into this new world, I used to sell stuff, but it was other people's stuff. When I'm now selling, this is me. It's very personal. And putting a price tag on that brings up all sorts of emotions around that. And rejection of the thing is me. That's a whole set of mindset and belief systems that I had to inspect and work on in this new arena. And when I started to realize that my natural impulse was to want to undercut myself just to get a yes, that was in my 95%. I was realizing I was so afraid of rejection on some level that it held me back from the abundance that I deserved, like from being able to attract the kinds of clients and the kind of money that I deserve. So in that 5%, I hacked, right? Like Jonathan, you're talking about it. I said, you know what? This next time that I have an opportunity, I'm going to raise my price. And I'm going to do it in a way where I'm going to throw up in my mouth. And if I don't, then I know it's not a high enough price. And once that happened and people started saying yes, that became a habit for me. And that slid into my 95%. So you can consciously decide new behaviors, new ways of being, and that's going to take a lot of effort and energy. That's where your 5% comes in. And you do it long enough that it slides into your 95%. It becomes habitual. It's on autopilot. Then you can climb the next ladder.
That story is so personal for me because as you were saying it, I was feeling the fear for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get that. I'm glad because I could have used you when I was actually there, my friend.
Thanks for sharing. At a very vulnerable level, I would undercut myself every single time. And I'm sure that as we talk to people about doing side hustles and essentially creating an idea or a passion that essentially you are the product in many cases, that is almost a palpable fear. What am I worth? What is my value? Without
question. And one of the great books to get around that is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And he talks about this big concept of resistance. And he says, we all have 2 lives, the life that we live and the unlived life within us, right? And so it's that life that you really want to live, but the resistance that holds you back from going there. And he said, if you've ever been a writer who doesn't write, if you're a speaker who doesn't speak, if you're an actor who doesn't act, if you're an entrepreneur who doesn't own his own business or her business, then you know what resistance is about. And one of the key themes that he talks about in that book is he actually had to create almost a fictional shell company for himself, like Stephen Pressfield Inc., that when he would submit, say, a new novel or a book or a screenplay, whatever it was he was doing, he would submit it under the Stephen Pressfield Inc. business. So if it got rejected, it was his business getting rejected and not him. You get the distinction there. So it's like a little bit of a way for anyone out there who's interested in building a side hustle but has that fear, that's a great way for you to kind of give a little separation to you and the work that you're putting out.
A wonderful tip. So Dom, I know essentially this is all happening inside of this 3-step construct of drift, and you call it the ADD cycle. And step 1 was this essential awakening. Step 2 was the disruption, which we've touched on. And now step 3, and essentially the highlight of a lot of what you talk about, is designing the future you want to live into. Is that right?
Yeah, you got it, Jonathan. You nailed it. So the thing that you talk about all the time here, right, on your podcast is being intentional around your money. And what I'm talking about here is being intentional around designing the future, and not just designing any future, but designing a future that, like, you can't wait to live into, right? One that's dynamic, one that's exciting, one that maybe has a little bit of mystery. And if those things like appeal to you, great. Or if safety is something that like is really appealing to you, and security and predictability, then those are the things that are also the future that you want, that you can't wait to live into. But to get really clear on what that is, I have this one exercise that I love doing that I'll share with your listeners, that it's provocative, but it's one of the greatest ways for you to get really clear on what you want that future to look like. Because before I set up the exercise, I want to share with you some of the problems that people have in really envisioning what their future is. So first of all, it's people are so stuck in their current state that it's really hard for them to kind of get their head above water and look far enough out to say what would be exciting to me.
And I think that idea of being stuck feels a lot like the hamster wheel. And people in many cases trap themselves to their lifestyle due to just the amount of time they put in their 9 to 5, which becomes a 9 to 10, into the financial obligations that they take on, the oversized house, the oversized mortgage, the oversized car, and then the activities that they sign up for, volunteering from everything to be everything to everybody and not holding anything in reserve. And a lot of those things contribute to you both being financially stuck and unable to get any leverage, or alternatively, just being stuck mentally exhausted and not willing to recapture anything for yourself to grow yourself as a person.
Yeah, Jonathan, as you were saying that, like I just felt heavy, right? I mean, that is the weight that so many people are carrying around, and it doesn't have to be that way, but that's how a lot of people are feeling. And it's really hard to say, hey, what do you want in the next 5 years to look like? And with that weight, that albatross around their neck, to be able to come up with anything that's going to be inspiring, because they just don't believe that they can move to that place in such like five years seems like a short period of time, even though we know a lot can be accomplished. It just occurs as like so close given all of the weight that's on their shoulders. So what I like to do is this provocative exercise with my clients, and I call it writing your own eulogy. And so people like bristle when they hear, whoa, a eulogy, and because that has connotations of death. And I say, no, this is not about thinking about the death element of it. It's thinking about the celebration of life element. Because if you're to fast forward to the end of your life, there's going to be a time where someone is going to be reading some really nice things about you that you're never going to hear. But wouldn't it be nice if you didn't even need to well, you're not going to be around for it anyway, but wouldn't it be nice to not need to be around for it because you've lived your life with such intentionality that you knew exactly what they were going to say anyway? And so one of the things that I direct people to do is to say, how long is it that you want to live? And most people haven't even contemplated that question. A lot of people, you'd be surprised, but a lot of people just base it off of their family history. And one time, one of my clients had gone through this. He came back with like 63 years old. I said, 63, dude, why? And he goes, well, my father died when he was 62 and my grandfather died when he was 61. I just figured I'd be, and so that translated into the way that he was treating his body, he was treating his life, because he thought that he only had maybe 2 decades left. Versus, well, doesn't have to be that way. If you really got to call your own shots and you took care of yourself and you designed an intentional future, how long would you want to live? And in many cases, I end up seeing people just start to extend their lives to 80 or 90. Mine is way out of whack, which if you'll read the book, you'll see how far I plan on living. But that creates a different kind of awareness right now for how should I be treating myself. The next question I like to ask is, what were the things that you experienced during that period of life? Because guess what? Many of the best days of your life have not even happened yet. Let that one sink in, right? Like some of the best days of your life, many of them have not even happened yet. And how cool is that, knowing that you're going to live into that at some point? And what could you do now to set that up for those exciting moments to occur? And what did you leave behind, right? Like what lives on beyond you? So were there people that were impacted? Is there a system that was set up that lives on beyond you, whether it's a business that other people are working for or a philanthropic exercise, whatever? And if you get really clear on what those things are, and by the way, this changes all the time, but like if you can get clear on what those things are, it gives you a kind of urgency in this moment to say, am I doing the things right now that are tracking me towards that?
And one thing that strikes me as you're saying this is I'm thinking to myself, when these people write their eulogies, I doubt that the job, their 9 to 5, is mentioned really anywhere in there.
Exactly. And you know what? And I, Jonathan, I love the example that you brought up here, because one of the things that I want to be mindful of is it's almost without fail, people come back with this exercise and they go, my job didn't show up anywhere. I hate my job. I should leave my job. And I say, okay, Like if that's actually how you feel, great. Like let's plan your escape route. The other thing that I like to do, because a lot of people aren't in that position, at least now or anytime in the near future, is to say, you know what, work does provide and can very much provide a lot of these things that it is you want, whether it's through like financial income, whether it's through personal development or professional development. And if you can start to draw links between the work that you're doing and finding that it has a meaning and it serves a bigger purpose for you, then the work that you thought sucked so much doesn't suck so much anymore. And it gives you a little extra hop in your step and intentionality when you show up because of that. So I'm glad you brought that up, man. It gave me a chance to make that distinction.
Well, and I feel bad because I think I just threw work under the bus, but actually I love what you just said because that is a mental hack there that is incredibly valuable. And I think the FI community gets probably a justified bad rap for trashing work a little bit too much. I don't think it's intentional, but I think we've created a construct in which we're pursuing our passions. And many times those passions do not include work. But having said that, if you can get to a place where you are just thrilled to be in your job, you're loving your job, and your job is helping you pursue some of your other passions, those two can run in tandem. And frankly, we will continue to do a really bad job of helping people love their job more. I just have a feeling that's not going to be something we're good at, but I think it is incredibly valuable just to take a couple minutes. And this mental hack you provided would definitely be a key to doing that.
Yeah, right on.
And Dom, another aspect that you talk about with designing is believing that you have the ultimate authority over your life. And I'd love for you to talk about that because I think that is just such a huge mental shift as opposed to just passively going through life, being on this hamster wheel, letting outside forces impact everything that happens to you, shifting that and having this authority over your life. And that's just such a crucial concept. So yeah, I'd definitely love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So ultimate authority is one that it's a heavy concept and it's one that you have to accept with great responsibility, because when I say that you have ultimate authority over your life, it sounds inspiring until you realize that the life that you're currently in right now, if it's unappealing to you, if the conditions are not where you want them to be, you have to first accept responsibility for being where you are. And in many cases, it's because of the decisions that you have made that have gotten you to where you are. So for example, if you're in debt, or if you're in a job that you hate, or a relationship that's no longer serving you and you still continue to stay there, a lot of the strategies for dealing with that is to blame outside forces. It's like, well, my partner changed when we got married, or this job we got acquired and now new management's coming over and everything's shifting. And I understand that there are dynamics that you cannot control, but you absolutely have ultimate authority over how you respond to those external conditions.
So the dark side of ultimate authority is ultimate responsibility.
Yeah. And that's the dark side. And it's also the bright side too, right? Because when you can take that responsibility and realize that, you know what, if I'm in this situation and I feel like crap, it should be a trigger to you to say, okay, this is like my alarm point now to get myself out of it. But it usually takes some tough medicine in order to get yourself out. And so a lot of people find themselves stuck in this space. And if you're really going to take on this concept of ultimate authority, then what I'd encourage you to do is to go to the people or look at models, role models and examples of people who have gotten out of the situation, who have been effective in dealing with those things that you have, that you are struggling with right now. What I find most times is people go for help to the people who are closest to them. So if they're in a bad relationship, they'll go to another person who's their friend who's also in a crappy relationship and ask for advice. And then they end up having twice as crappy advice and they get stuck there. It's the same thing for people making financial decisions, right? So go and talk to the people who have modeled the kind of success or behavior that you want. And then when you're able to take the ultimate authority, then you start to find that there's no situation that you can find yourself in that will ever defeat you. And when that happens, freedom, ultimate.
Yeah, I love that. And I find now that I'm aware of this, after you've made me aware of it, that I hear people's stories and they're constantly coming up with excuses of why they can't do something. And often it's a deep-seated issue that they might not even realize, right? They've convinced themselves that they're inferior or that they can't for some reason because of X, Y, and Z, right? And you could fill in a million things in the blanks. But when you just shift, when you have that subtle shift to realize that you do have authority over everything that happens to you, it's like this aha moment. And like I'm saying here, I notice it now everywhere. And you can't go around, unfortunately, telling everybody, hey, you have to stop that. You have to stop that. But I'm trying subtly to help impact people in my own life and help them realize you do have say over what happens to you. And you need to stop, as we're saying here, you need to stop drifting, and you need to just realize you can impact your life in ways that you had not previously realized.
Without question. And when you finally get to that stage, it's just like a new horizon, a blank canvas, like whatever you want to paint on that future becomes available to you.
Wow. Yeah, man, this is fantastic. So one obvious question that strikes me is you've had the chance to coach hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, and you've helped mentor them through this process. But what does your eulogy look like? What's in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I have in the book here, and this has constantly been a theme that's come up for me, even however many times I've rewritten my eulogy, is Dominick left a legacy of love for people. He had an insatiable interest in other people, seeing people how they wanted to be seen. The highest compliment he ever received was, "You make me love myself when I'm in your presence." And it was a compliment he received often. His life's purpose was to constantly strive to be the best version of himself and help other people do the same. The people whose lives he touched became better husbands, wives, parents, children, business owners, workers, and humans. And the communities they impacted created a ripple effect felt across the world. And, I go on to say a couple of other things about, like, I've trained over 1 million people and I've written New York Times bestselling books, et cetera. And these are massive types of ambitions that I have. And it's exciting to me to think that, like, that will be in my future. And obviously it could also seem a little bit overwhelming. It's like, that seems so far away. And when my clients do these things, they say the same thing. It's like, I love that, but then how do I make it real? So I end up chunking it down to, I help people to look at their next year, but more specifically, the next 90 days. And the reason why I love 90-day period of time is because it's just far enough away for you to be able to get big things done, but it's also close enough, like the finish line is close, so that you never lose this sense of intentional urgency. And there's two types of urgency. There's like the kind of urgency that most people run around with, which is the frenetic, anxious, 1,000,000 miles a minute, getting things done type of person. Then there's the intentionally urgent person who they're on a path, right? They're on a mission because what they're doing is so important. And that's what shows up, like with you two guys, when you're doing your podcast and the work that you're doing, is because you know what that ultimate vision is for yourself and where you want to be potentially in the next year. And therefore it shows up in the quality of your podcast. So what I end up having people do is I say, just identify one goal, maybe two maximum, but I really like to focus on one thing that you want over the next 90 days. And if you were to get that thing over the next 90 days, how would that change your life? So for example, let's just say some of my clients will come to me and say, I want to lose 20 pounds. I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a nutritionist, but like weight is a thing for a lot of high performers because they're spending so much time being busy elsewhere. Okay, if you were to lose 20 pounds at the end of 90 days, what effect would that have on your life? I'd be confident, I'd fit in my clothes, my love life would be better with my spouse. Okay, great. You're finding out if the juice is worth the squeeze. And if these benefits of losing the 20 pounds don't light you up, then you're going to abandon mission when things get tough. If it does light you up, if the juice is worth the squeeze and you're like, I want that, I'm foaming at the mouth, I need to have that, then I say, okay, like what are the big action steps that you need to get done by the time the 90 days are complete? And those action steps are the things that you have control over. And it could be, I need to do 50 workouts in the next 90 days or 40 workouts. I need to schedule all of them. I need to be a part of a community. Brad, do you like CrossFit? Because there's a community element to it. So that needs to be part of it. Great. And then to make it really actionable, what do you need to do over the first week to make sure that you get all those major action steps done at the end of the 90 days? And it could be something as simple as go on your calendar, block off the 30 or 40 workouts, put it on your calendar for the next 90 days, research 3 workout facilities that could be interesting to you, talk to 5 friends who have done like a great transformation in terms of their weight, and then bang, you're off to the races and you've just made it real.
And I can say anecdotally, when I look at the biggest strides that this podcast has made over the last 6 months, when I look back at the root source of those process improvements, it goes back to Brad Brad and I having a conversation saying, what is the one thing that we can work on this week? What is the 5 things that we can work on over the next month? Where is it that we want to put our focus that will have the greatest impact looking back 3 months from now? Across the board, I can say that.
See? And then it's like, Brad, I think you said this before, those incremental wins stacked up over a course of time. And I love to say, like, relentlessly accumulate small wins. Because when you relentlessly accumulate those small wins, then the tipping point occurs. And then all of a sudden, everyone looks from the outside and goes, wow, you were that overnight success, or wow, like what happened to you? And you're like, nah, this has just been the way that I've been living for, 90 days, 180 days, 5 years, an entire lifetime.
Yeah, and I think that ties into what we talk about here with the FI community is just making these small changes. And we talk about it in the context of finances, but it really can be your entire life. And we do try to talk about that as well. But when you start just making these small changes, there is that tipping point eventually where someone can go from, in the financial context, saving nothing to saving 50% of their income, which would sound ludicrous if you started at zero. But when you make those tiny little changes over and over a period of time, that's what I've found for me personally makes the biggest impact on my life. It's not the dramatic change. It's these tiny little things that just compound year after year, decade after decade, and just radically transforms your life. But again, from these tiny little ways.
Right on. And it's going to occur to other people as dramatic because they're not paying attention to your every move, but you're living those every moves. And therefore, the net effect of that is that dramatic savings or that dramatic weight loss or that dramatic freedom when you leave corporate and people go, whoa, what the heck happened? And it looked like it was just so sudden. And you're like, no, this is what I've been plotting for, meticulously, intentionally for quite a bit of time.
Love that word, plotting.
All right, Dom. So you talked about really chunking things down into these little decisions and on this path for your 90 days. And you also mentioned the first week and how that can be difficult for people. But I assume because of the excitement level that the majority or vast majority of people get through that first week or two. But in reading your book and speaking with you, I know the excitement does wear off at some point. And I'm curious when you generally see that and what tips you have to help people stay on the path for their 90-day goals.
This is a great question. And this is huge in terms of like being able to get what it is that you want. So there's really 3 parts to almost any process. And I like to talk about it in terms of energy, right? So when you are going to take something on, there's 3 types of energy towards executing on something. You have the starting energy, then you move into the sustaining energy, and then you have the finishing energy. Starting energy is always the best, right? It's like that romantic connection for the first time, that honeymoon period. Everything is sunshine and rainbows, and like you're so fired up to get things started because it's novel, it's new. You're going off of adrenaline, and then all of a sudden reality kicks in. Right? So in the terms of a relationship context, the dirty socks are on the floor, the person blows their nose too loud, like there's just something insufferable about them. And then all of a sudden it's like, God, this is not as glamorous as it once was. Same thing goes for like working out. Same thing might happen for when you start to save money for the first time. It could feel great watching that bank account go up. And then all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, maybe I'd like to splurge on that dinner and the reality kicks in. What you need to understand about the distinction between starting energy and sustaining energy is that they're 2 totally different things. And people seem to mistake and confuse sustaining energy as being bad or that like you are no longer motivated to do the thing because it just doesn't feel as glamorous or sexy as the starting energy. When in reality, you're just downshifting into another part of the process. So what I give for advice is to say, anticipate that after. It could be, if you're working in the context of 90 days, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. There's going to be a downshift in enthusiasm. And when it comes, just say, great, okay. And you may need to dial back some of your behavior. So if you were working out 4 times a week before, maybe you can only do 3 times a week now, but don't stop altogether. And if you were saving at a certain rate and you're finding out that it was too restrictive, maybe you need to dial it back, whatever. Don't eliminate your saving altogether just because the glamour has gone away. Stay the course. And I think the other big key, Brad, in terms of a tip that I would put up there is that's why the beginning part of the process of like getting really clear on what is the goal And if you were to achieve that goal, is the juice worth the squeeze? If it's actually going to make a meaningful difference in your life, if you're so clear on that, then when the downshift occurs and the initial momentum has worn off, you will still stay the course because you know how important it is. And then the finishing energy, it's just, especially for people who are doing the side hustle thing, right? Like where you're about to launch, you put like a lot of work out together, and then you get stuck in perfectionism. That finishing energy is really around like eliminating the perfectionism. Nothing's going to be perfect. You need to be able to like get that thing out there and get it done, and then feedback will occur and you can start a new cycle of starting, sustaining, and finishing.
I love that idea of putting the emphasis on the published product. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it. It doesn't have to be perfect. I know that I've put stuff out there that in retrospect was garbage, but I got it out there and there was value just to getting something on the floor for public consumption. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Without question. I mean, you have to get it out there so that you can get feedback on like what's working, what's not. And to ever have the belief that everything is going to be perfect, that is going to be one of the greatest limiting things of your life. And so you hear people like Tim Ferriss and others, they're always talking about get it out. Perfect is the enemy of done. So a great example of that is a friend of mine. Her name is Elmira. And Elmira has a great book called From the Other Side of the World. And she has interviewed people from third world countries who could be the next Steve Jobs, right, in these other countries. And she was at a kind of a press conference of sorts where other people who had wanted to write a book who were stuck in this perfectionism and not written one. So I got up on stage with her and I said, Elmira, you have a book, right? She said, yeah. And I said, are there mistakes in your book? She said, yeah. I'm like, are there stories that you found out after it went to print that you wish were in the book? She's like, yeah. I'm like, would you rewrite chapters again if like you could? And she's like, yeah, I really wish I could. And then I turned to the audience and I held up her book and I said, but she's got a bleeping book. Nice. And everyone in there in the room looked at that and they said, yeah, it's never going to be perfect, but we're sitting here listening to her because she's the authority. She got something done. There's a publisher that's put their seal of approval on this, and she's out there with something that she can work with. So I say to anyone who's got something like you're going to hit that point where the fear, that resistance, like with Stephen Pressfield before, I was talking about the war of art, you're going to hit that point. You have to be ready to pull that trigger.
That had to be one of those just epiphany type moments for the people in the audience. I love it.
Yeah.
So Dom, the last thing that I just want to read is a quote from your book. And I just thought this was a powerful and perfect way to end it, which is the quality of the external world you design is 100% a product of the internal world you've curated. And I'd love to hear you just talk about that because that hit me on such a deep level. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Going back to Man's Search for Meaning in Viktor Frankl, and he talks about, being in the most hopeless of circumstances, right? Like when you can no longer change your external circumstances, like being someone who is in a concentration camp, right? You cannot change your external circumstances. You are forced to change your internal state. And I hope for everyone who's listening, we'll never have to find ourselves anywhere near a situation that dire. But we find ourselves in a place where we have a lot of freedoms right now that we don't choose to take advantage of. And therefore, if we can really get inside and start to unpack some of these limiting beliefs, we start to listen to podcasts like yours and other people's, read books, go on personal development journeys and exploration where you can start to really look at the stuff that's in your blind spots. And there's going to be fear and there's going to be a little bit of throw up in the mouth. But once you can curate that internal state, then no external condition could ever mess you up or take you off your path. It's just when that outside force thrusts itself upon you, you almost smile and laugh at it and say, bring it on, because this is an opportunity for me to actually get stronger, to learn to be more powerful. And for most people, it's an opportunity to be a victim and to complain and let everyone else hear about it. That's not you. You're not listening to this podcast because that's who you are. So if you can really start to curate that internal state, then you're going to find the riches around you that you want. You're going to find the freedom that you want. You're going to attract the community of people who are like-minded like you. And then there's that network effect where the better it gets, the better it gets.
This was a transition for us. This particular episode was one that we were so incredibly excited to do because you are our first guest that is outside of the FI community, but your message runs so perfectly in parallel to the ideas and the concepts that we've been talking about now for over 60 episodes. And we were thrilled to get a chance to have you on.
In starting to listen to your podcast, I couldn't believe how much of FI I already do unintentionally, right? So I think of myself as like unintentionally part of the FI community, and the more that I learn and listen to what you guys talk about, it's like, man, I am one of your kind. And it's funny because I spent 15 years in financial services and I never heard the term, which just goes to show you the state of affairs, right, in that industry. But Brad and I have had these long conversations around, the reason why he's interested in FI is because the big word is freedom for him. And he chooses his gateway through FI to get the ultimate freedom to do the things he wants to do in life, structure his life the way that he wants to, spend his time with his family and the people he cares about. And my big word is also freedom. Like, I am obsessed with having freedom of choice and freedom of opportunity, but my gateway is through what gives you the most energy. And I suppose like that could be the parallel that I end up drawing, which is like you get the most energy through understanding what lights you up. So what do you guys think about that?
I think I love it. You're unintentionally FI. That's awesome. Let's patent that. And since we've gotten a chance to partner with you for this episode and really bring this information to the forefront of people's minds, we think it would be unfair to leave this episode right here. So we want to offer you the opportunity to tackle the hot seat. Are you ready for this?
Oh, heck yeah.
All right, let's do it.
In a world drowning in debt and rampant consumption, trapped by the chains of lifestyle inflation, these questions highlight the secrets of those who have broken free. Welcome to the Choose FI Hot Seat.
All right, man. Are you terrified?
I want the hot seat guy to like narrate my life. And I don't know if that's
or your eulogy. Could he do your eulogy?
Can we please?
That would be awesome. Yeah, we'll give you the link to Fiverr where Jonathan found that.
Oh my God, please do. I can't wait.
All right, man, you got it.
All right, Dom, the first question, the favorite blog that's not your own.
All right, so I got two quick ones for you. Michael Hyatt is the guy that I think it's the only blog that I subscribe to right now outside of Tim Ferriss. And so Michael Hyatt's a former publisher. He owned a publishing company, and he has a lot of really practical tips on how to be more productive and how to find meaning in your life. He's written a couple of best-selling books. Maybe you guys are familiar with him. Some of his titles are, how to get to inbox zero. Is that possible? 5 biggest reasons you're procrastinating. I find his stuff to be really useful and well thought out. But the one that I'm really passionate about, and the reason why I didn't lead with this is it's not technically a blog. It's kind of like a YouTube show, and there's a podcast, is Impact Theory by Tom Bilyeu. He was the one who invented Quest Nutrition, if you've ever seen those Quest bars. Tom Bilyeu is by far the best, when I'm talking about someone who interviews like the world's best, like Tony Robbins or Tim Ferriss or those guys, no one has a more prepared stance than Tom Bilyeu. So if you want access to some of the best in the world in all areas of the world, whether it's personal development, whether it's entrepreneurship, et cetera, he's got an unbelievable podcast.
And Tom Bilyeu was introduced to me by none other than Brad Barrett.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah, I love Tom. And yeah, him and his message, as well as Jocko Willink, that ties into like the extreme ownership concept that Jocko talks about and that we've talked about here on this podcast with you. It's understanding you have control over your own world. And yeah, Impact Theory unquestionably is one of my favorite podcasts. I listen to it. It actually comes out multiple times a week. So I'd highly recommend everyone out there subscribe to that and listen to it. It'll definitely change the way you think about the world.
All right, question number 2. Your favorite article of all time. Now, this could be one that you've written or it could be someone else's.
I love The Busy Trap by Tim Creeder. And this came out in the New York Times 2012. So I think it's even more relevant today than it was 5 years ago. And he talks about how everyone's running around so busy. And he calls people out on it. He said, busy is really a boast disguised as a complaint. And the fact that like we say we're so busy because it makes us feel important, and it signals to other people that we're important. And anyone who's not busy, therefore, must not be important. But we get stuck in this, perpetual state of busyness. And he also has this unbelievable quote that says, busyness serves as a kind of existential reassurance a hedge against emptiness. And I find this to be exceptionally true for a lot of the high performers I work with, where if they stop achieving, if they stop doing and checking off boxes, then they start to feel like the emptiness inside or the guilt for not getting things done. And that was one of the key articles that led me to start to question my existence of how busy I was all the time. And I would tell you that I've never been less busy in my life and more successful in my life since I've started to create intentionality around like, where am I spending my time? How am I applying my energy? And I think that this article is one of the key turning points for that for me.
You know, this is a concept that really we probably need to have as its own show. And I will say that for me, that concept, it's like the supervillain in a Marvel or DC movie. It's just outside of sight. And I can feel it always in my life as an outside presence that I could be a victim to. It's very close to being a very real vice for me. And I fight it constantly. That fear of not having anything immediately to do, which is inevitably results in me checking my phone 25 times a day or constantly going to the email or looking at a stat or something totally inane and ridiculous, but it's this almost supervillain just out of sight trying to steal my time away from me.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll add a little something extra here for you. If checking your phone is one of those things that seems to be a go-to in like the busy trap for you, download the app called Moment. If you have an iPhone, it's called Moment. If you have like an Android, it's called Quality Time. The Moment app will tell you how many times you've unlocked your phone over the course of the day. It will tell you how much screen time you've spent on it over the course of the day. And it will timestamp so that you can know like what parts of the day you're opening it the most and how much time you're spending on it the most. Now, this is going to ruin your phone for you the way that like calorie counter started ruining like the glass case at Starbucks. Like you know everything that's going in your body now. Most people underestimate their phone use by about 50%. And I'm not prescriptive around how much you should use your phone, but like most people don't even have an idea of how often they go to and how pervasive it is and what the effect it is on your ability to stay present and focused. So give that a shot, Jonathan. Maybe next time we talk, it'll be interesting to see if you've been able to create a little bit of a break on that.
Just the fact that I'm terrified that you told me about this app tells you how bad it probably is.
Yeah.
That's awesome, though. I love that.
Yeah, that actually might be the answer to number 3 here. But what's your favorite life hack?
All right, my favorite life hack. So this is something that helps you to reduce your stress. It helps you to generate way more creative ideas. It helps you to learn and retain information over the course of time and reduce your risk for brain illnesses over the course of your lifetime. And it's absolutely free. You guys guess what this is?
Oh, Brad's right there. He has his hand up. I'm pretty sure it's meditation, though.
Brad, it's meditation. Yeah, it's meditation. So 4 or 5 years ago, like 4.5 years ago, when I discovered meditation, it continues to be a superpower for me. And 44% of U.S. businesses will have a formal mindfulness program incorporated before the end of 2017. Prudential, my former employer, has serenity rooms now, and they have a guided meditation that you could call once a week that's 10 minutes long, and it's a different meditation every week. I've used it to help me overcome some of the greatest fears of my life, to generate some of the most creative ideas of my life. If you remember where we started our conversation, the reason why I was able to go off and do this thing that I'm doing right now is because I had the download during meditation. I overcame the biggest fear that I ever had during meditation. And the last thing I'll say about it is we had that conversation around creating the space between stimulus and response. If you ever need to know how to, meditation is a great way to create that space, that slowing down, that pause between something happening and you reacting. And meditation has, changed my life in that regard.
Do you have any particular apps that you'd recommend that you use personally?
I don't do a lot of guided meditation. I do my own. So Headspace is the most popular one that people have told me that they enjoy using because it keeps you accountable. There's like a gamification element to it that, you accumulate a certain amount of days and wins that can get your practice going. So I would say I'd point people there. And then, Brad, from the men's retreat, our good friend Corey Muscara. Corey has a number of resources on his website, and his name is spelled CoryMuscara. And he's got a lot of stuff out there that you could search as well, and he's great.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to that in the show notes.
Question number 4, your biggest financial mistake.
This goes back to one of the podcasts you had recently with Alan Donegan on here. And he was saying, you don't need to spend money before you launch your business. And that's exactly the mistake that I made. Before I launched this business, I ended up getting a video done that cost me $7,000. I ended up getting contracts written up for like speaking engagements and coaching, whatever. That was another $3,500. And there was plenty of other stuff I spent money on, but I spent over $10,000 before I tested my concept, before, I had something out in any public forum. And what ended up happening was like the video, I don't even use anymore. The contracts I barely ever use, probably could have got them done for free. And those were the biggest financial mistakes I made, especially when it came to my business. And I listened to Alan's podcast with you guys and like couldn't have agreed more. Everything that I do now when I have a new concept is I bring it out and I start to sell it, and I find out like how much people are willing to pay for it and if it's even a concept that's worth. And to a T, everything he said has come true in terms of the way that my business is manifested. So no more mistakes around spending before I put my business offers out.
Nice. I love the continuity. I'm so glad you went back to specifically Alan's episode and said that was useful for you going forward as well, and that it's something that you had identified in your past. I love that, just that reach back. So thanks for drawing on that as a reference.
You bet.
All right, Dom, question number 5, the advice you would give your younger self.
Gosh, it's either break rules, because I never broke any, or more specifically, contrarian thinking. So anytime that people say that there's a way that has to get done, just the more people that believe in something automatically question it. And it doesn't mean you have to believe the opposite. It just means question it, because there's all sorts of opportunity there. And the whole reason why you guys have this podcast is because you're questioning the way that people have made financial decisions forever. The reason why I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing is because I believe people can, in fact, design their future in a way that it's exciting for them to live into versus just doing what everyone else is expected of you and getting married when you're supposed to, having kids when you're supposed to, taking on the debt that you're supposed to. It doesn't have to be that way. So I would say younger self, anytime that someone says you have to do it a certain way, start to question the opposite.
Because you were born to do more than pay bills and die.
Yeah. Well said.
All right.
All right, Dom, we have a little bonus question. I know you're a huge fan of Amazon.com. What was your favorite purchase you made on Amazon last year?
I think I buy everything about by Amazon. And by the way, does like everything I bought in Whole Foods this year count as Amazon now? I don't know. The favorite thing I bought for someone else. So one of my friends got sick. I ended up buying him an entire box of Big League Chew, the grape kind. Wow. And that just made his day. But for me, it was a book called Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel. And for anyone who's really interested in like the next level of human performance, must read book. So they talk about flow state, which is kind of like being in the zone, and how people can now start to, instead of accidentally finding yourself in the zone or flow state, which is like, Michael Jordan couldn't miss a basket. Like when you're writing, it just feels like someone else is writing through your hand, or like when you're in that state of like unconscious being where everything's perfect. They're starting to hack ways that you can automatically get into that state for optimal performance. And the Navy SEALs and Google is already starting to implement systems that allow people to access those states on demand. And for anyone who's interested in being like the highest version of themselves, this is the kind of brain food that will blow your mind. And it takes a lot to blow my mind these days, but this book blew my mind.
Wow. Dom, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, for blowing our minds, for sharing your vision for this parallel storyline about designing your future. Thrilling stuff, very exciting. And honestly, it runs so perfectly in parallel to the contrarian point of view that we're trying to pass along to our audience. So we really appreciate you taking time and coming on the show today. For our audience, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you for having me on, Brad. You're the man. And the way you get in touch with me, my website is DominickQ.com. I spell Dominick the correct way, which I'm sure you'll link in the notes, but it's DOMINICKQ.com. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. Those are my two biggest ways. I'm not a huge social media user, but those are my two biggest ways.
All right. So before we go, we just wanted to let you know that Dominick has just released his new book, Design Your Future, 3 Simple Steps to Stop Drifting and Start Living. It is a book that we heavily sourced to do this podcast, and there's so much more in here. This was really just a taste. We want to share this with you. And so for our community, he's actually opening this up for early release to audience members who would like to go ahead and read the remainder of the book. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of this, you can just go to choosefi.com/design, DESIGN, choosefi.com/design. And I highly encourage you to grab a copy of this book. It will have a positive impact in the life you want to live. The fire is spreading, my friends, and we'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.
You've been listening to Choose FI Radio Podcast, where we help middle-class America build wealth. one life hack at a time.